Hello everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. It was a bitterly cold October night when James Foster found himself driving along the familiar stretch of road, his truck rumbling steadily through the darkened countryside. He had driven this route 100 times before, each time the same eerie stretch of highway, flanked by rows of gnarled trees that whispered in the wind. Yet tonight, there was something different, something in the air. The wind howled outside his truck, carrying with it an unsettling chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of his body. A chill that wasn't just from the cold, but from something deeper, something ancient. He shifted uneasily in his seat, adjusting the rearview mirror, but it didn't help. His breath fogged the windshield, despite the heater running full blast. He told himself it was nothing, just another long night, another hour of driving to keep him awake. After all, he'd heard the stories from the locals in town about this stretch of road being haunted. But James had been driving for years. He wasn't about to let a few ghost stories spook him. But then it happened. As he rounded the curve of the winding road, the headlights of his truck sliced through the darkness, revealing something he hadn't expected. A figure standing tall by the shoulder of the road. The first thing James noticed was how unnatural it seemed. This man wasn't waving his arm or pacing restlessly, like most hitchhikers did. No, he was standing still, as though frozen in place, his thumb raised high in the universal gesture for a ride. James squinted, trying to make sense of the sight. The man's appearance was odd. His clothes were too neat, too pristine for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere at this hour of night. His suit, a dark, well-tailored ensemble, was completely free of dirt or wrinkles, an impossibility for a man who had likely been out here for hours, perhaps days. His shoes gleamed in the headlights, as if freshly polished. And then, as James's truck approached, the sensation grew stronger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, the air in the cab suddenly oppressive, heavier. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees all at once, and the truck felt like it was driving through a heavy fog, though there was none. The stranger's head was lowered, casting his face in shadow, but something in the posture seemed wrong. He didn't sway slightly with the wind, nor did he shuffle his feet in impatience. He stood, motionless, like a statue. But there was an intensity about him. As James slowed his truck to a crawl, the fog creeping up around the tires, the figure's head lifted just enough to reveal his face. James froze. The man's face was sickly pale, almost translucent. His skin had a sheen to it, a ghostly glow that didn't seem quite natural in the moonlight. His eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, were deep, voids that stared right through James, into the depths of his very soul. They didn't blink, didn't even seem to register the truck passing by. Instead, they were fixed, unwavering. The longer James looked, the more he felt a cold weight in his chest, a pressure building inside him that he couldn't explain. A cold rush of fear gripped James's heart. His foot slammed on the brake, and his truck jolted to a halt just a few feet away from the figure. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his breath shallow and quick. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, to drive away fast and never look back. Every warning, every piece of advice he'd ever heard about picking up strangers, and especially hitchhikers, flooded his mind. But he couldn't move. His eyes remained locked with the stranger's, and for a split second, James felt as though he had no control over his body. It was as if an invisible force had him in its grip, paralyzing him. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, trembling, as the figure took a small, slow step forward. The air around them grew colder, and the truck's lights flickered in a brief stutter, as if the very electricity was being drained from the world around them. Would James pick him up? Or would he drive away, leaving the mysterious man behind? But before he could decide, the stranger took another step forward, this time, toward the truck door. The rattling of chains seemed to echo from somewhere deep in the mist, though James could see nothing in the darkness beyond the headlights. His heart skipped a beat. What was that sound? There was a quiet pause, just long enough for James to feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. He had to act. He had to do something. But would it be too late? James's foot hovered over the brake, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The stillness outside seemed to suffocate him. He could feel the weight of the air pressing in on him, thick and suffocating. The moonlight barely filtered through the dense fog, but it was enough to reveal the eerie, unmoving figure standing just a few feet away. The stranger was still motionless, his eyes locked onto James's with an unnerving intensity. There was something about the way he stood, too stiff, too controlled, as though every movement had been calculated, every gesture made with deliberate precision. The more James looked at him, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't looking at a man at all. The face, too pale and too smooth, the eyes too hollow and deep, all of it felt wrong. The overwhelming sensation that something supernatural was at play crept up James's spine like a slow, creeping chill. James had never been one to scare easily. As a truck driver, he'd driven through some of the most desolate stretches of road, had pulled over to help stranded drivers in the middle of nowhere, and had faced far more dangerous situations than a lone hitchhiker. But this felt different. The man wasn't just standing there, waiting to be picked up. No, he was watching. Observing. Almost, waiting for James to make a move. But James wasn't sure if that was a move he wanted to make. His eyes flicked nervously to the side mirror. The road was completely deserted. There was nothing else for miles. He was alone, completely isolated in the dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of his truck engine and the distant rustling of the trees that lined the roadside. A chill gripped him, and he couldn't help but glance back at the figure, his mind racing. Why wasn't the man moving? Why wasn't he making any sound? He should drive away. That was the sensible thing to do, wasn't it? He should ignore this bizarre encounter, keep the truck moving, and chalk it up to an overactive imagination. The voice in his head told him to go, to get out of there before something worse happened. But something about the way the stranger was standing made it impossible to turn away. And then, it happened. The figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed directly at James's truck. The gesture was so fluid, so unnatural, that James felt a shiver run down his spine. There was no mistaking it. The man wasn't asking for a ride. He was demanding something. And whatever it wasn't good. The air grew colder still, the fog thickening, curling around the truck like a living thing. The headlights flickered again, and James's heart skipped another beat. In the brief moment when the lights went out, everything around him plunged into darkness except for the stranger. In that moment, James could have sworn he saw something else. A glimpse of something, just behind the figure. Shadowy shapes, blurry and indistinct, moving within the mist. Shapes that didn't belong. James's pulse quickened. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his foot pressing harder against the brake pedal. He could feel the weight of the choice, the burden of this decision bearing down on him. Would he drive away, leaving the strange figure behind? Or would he give in to the unsettling feeling gnawing at him and open the door to a world he couldn't understand? Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered, jerking forward slightly before stalling. Panic surged through him as he turned the key, trying to restart the engine. But no matter how many times he tried, it refused to turn over. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural whisper, barely audible over the engine's sputtering. "Help me." It was the voice of a man. No, not a man. Something else. The voice was distorted, like it had been dragged across time and space, muffled by layers of something dark and cold. The whisper came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Help me." James's stomach twisted in horror. His eyes darted to the figure who was still standing motionless, but the air felt heavier now, as though the figure were drawing something out of the night itself. The truck's lights flickered back on with a sudden burst, and for a brief moment, James caught a glimpse of the stranger's face. But it wasn't the same face as before. The man's features were twisting, changing, distorting in unnatural ways. His pale skin stretched tight over a skull that seemed too thin, too sharp. His mouth opened, revealing sharp, uneven teeth, as his hollow eyes seemed to deepen and grow wider, swallowing all the light. The whisper came once more, this time an agonized scream. "Help me!" And just as suddenly as the moment had begun, it stopped. The figure was gone. The road was empty again, save for the fog that hung like a heavy curtain around the truck. The only sound now was the racing of James's heart, his breath shallow and quick. What had he just seen? What had just happened? He tried to start the truck again, but it stalled. He tried once more. This time, the engine roared to life. James's hands shook as he slowly put the truck in gear, his eyes darting nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him, even though the figure was gone. But when he finally dared to glance back, there was nothing. Nothing but the empty stretch of highway behind him, and the fog swirling into the night. But was the night really over? James's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again, knowing that if he did, he might see something he couldn't explain, something that would make his heart stop. He focused on the road ahead, his foot heavy on the gas pedal as he pushed the truck faster, eager to escape whatever had just happened. The fog seemed to thicken again, curling around his tires, as though the very road itself were trying to keep him in its grip. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the events that had just unfolded. Had he imagined it all? The strange man, the whispers, the unexplainable distortion of the figure's face? No. He couldn't have. The fear, the cold, the suffocating sensation, it had been all too real. But what had it been? Who was the man? What had he wanted? As he drove deeper into the night, the feeling of being watched never left him. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:47 a.m. His shift had ended hours ago, but something told him he wouldn't be able to rest until he got as far from that stretch of road as possible. But then, just as he was beginning to settle into the rhythm of the road, his headlights flickered once more. This time, they didn't come back on. The truck shuddered, the engine sputtering and then cutting off completely. James's stomach dropped. He quickly turned the key again, but the truck remained silent, unresponsive. Panic surged through him. He was stranded. And worse, he was stranded on the same haunted stretch of highway where he'd just encountered the figure. The fog was thicker now, pressing against the truck like a suffocating weight. It was difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him, the headlights offering only a dull glow in the sea of white mist. James cursed under his breath and reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark as he opened the truck door. The air outside was frigid, biting at his skin, and the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel felt deafening in the stillness. He knew he should have waited for roadside assistance, but something, an overwhelming need to escape, told him to check under the hood himself. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as he approached the front of the truck. His flashlight beam darted from side to side, casting strange shadows on the empty road. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind rustling in the trees, his own breath quick and shallow. But there was no sign of the mysterious figure. No movement. No one else in sight. As he crouched beside the engine, checking the wires and connections, a soft sound caught his attention. At first, it was so faint he thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate scraping noise, as though something heavy was being dragged along the ground. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The fog, thick as ever, had settled around him, blocking out any view beyond a few feet. But then he saw it. A shadow. A figure, moving with a strange, fluid motion just beyond the beam of his flashlight. His heart skipped a beat as the figure seemed to float just above the ground, its outline shifting and contorting in the mist. The scraping noise grew louder. James's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen to the spot. The figure was coming closer. And then he saw it, those eyes. Hollow, endless, dark pits where eyes should have been, just like the man he had seen earlier. It was the hitchhiker. Except this time, the figure was not standing still, waiting to be picked up. No, it was moving, and it was heading straight for him. The figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally long. The skin was so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness, and the air around it shimmered with an eerie energy, as though the very fabric of reality were warping. The scraping sound continued, growing louder and louder, as though chains or something heavy were being dragged through the dirt. James's heart raced, and every instinct in his body told him to flee, but his legs wouldn't move. His breath came in ragged gasps as the figure drew closer, its mouth opening to reveal a twisted, gaping hole where its teeth should have been. And then, it spoke. "Help me." The voice was the same as before, distorted, agonized, but with an added layer of menace. It echoed in James's mind, reverberating through his bones, and for a moment, he could feel the darkness pressing in on him, as though the figure's voice was a gateway to something far worse than he could comprehend. Just as the figure was within arm's reach, the truck's engine suddenly roared back to life, its headlights flashing on, cutting through the mist. The fog seemed to retreat slightly, and the figure staggered back, as though the light burned it. In that moment, the spell was broken. James didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He bolted for the truck, slamming the door shut and slamming his foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, nearly spinning out of control as he sped down the road, heart pounding in his chest. The fog began to thin, the road ahead clear for the first time since he'd seen the figure. But the feeling of being watched, of something following him, didn't fade. It was there, just beyond the edge of the headlights, lurking in the darkness. James didn't stop until he reached the nearest town, his hands shaking as he pulled into a gas station. He sat there, in the safety of the well-lit lot, staring at the road behind him. Was it really over? Had he escaped whatever that thing was? Or had he just stumbled upon something far darker than he could ever have imagined? The road seemed to stretch endlessly through the desolate countryside, an unforgiving ribbon of cracked asphalt slicing through the inky darkness. This highway had a history, one that locals spoke of in hushed tones, as if uttering its name too loudly might summon something unwelcome. It wound through isolated woods and empty fields, passing only the occasional, abandoned structure that stood like silent witnesses to the eerie quiet. Tall, ancient trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, reaching toward each other above the narrow stretch. In the moonlight, the branches cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement, giving the road an almost haunted appearance. Fog clung to the ground, wrapping itself around the trunks of trees and rolling over the road in thick, ghostly waves. For any traveler passing through, it was impossible to shake the feeling of being watched, like unseen eyes were tracking their every move from the darkness. Despite its quiet, almost tranquil appearance, there was something undeniably unsettling about this place. Even the animals seemed to avoid it. No chirping crickets or distant hoots of owls disturbed the silence. Only the faint rustle of leaves in the slight breeze dared to break the stillness, a reminder that nature, too, felt the weight of the road's eerie history. For years, stories had circulated about this highway, a tale passed from one wary local to another, whispered in gas stations and diners late at night. Travelers, especially those unfamiliar with the area, were warned never to linger here, especially after dark. As the legend went, a figure was known to appear by the roadside on especially foggy nights, a solitary, silent presence in the gloom. The silent hitchhiker, they called him. He would always be spotted just beyond the last gas station, a few miles into the winding, treacherous road. Some described him as a young man, perhaps in his 20s, with a solemn expression and an old-fashioned suit that seemed out of place, as if he'd stepped out of another time. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his dark eyes held a depth of sorrow that haunted those who saw him. Many had dismissed the hitchhiker as a figment of the imagination, a trick of the fog and shadows. But others, those who had seen him up close, spoke of an otherworldly quality about him, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. They claimed that he would appear at the side of the road, his thumb raised in a gesture both familiar and deeply unsettling, as if he were silently asking for help, for an escape from whatever held him there. But those who stopped to offer him a ride, it was said, never made it very far. According to the stories, they would feel a chill settle into the car, a creeping, bone-deep cold that no heater could banish. In the rear-view mirror, they'd catch glimpses of the figure always silent, his eyes locked forward, yet somehow aware. And before long, he would disappear, leaving nothing but the faint smell of something strange, almost metallic, lingering in the air. And yet, for some unknown reason, travelers kept spotting him. As the tales go, on certain nights when the fog is particularly thick and the air unusually still, an unlucky driver will catch sight of him. It always starts the same, the outline of a lone figure emerging through the fog, standing at the roadside in that same haunting stillness, his hand raised in a gentle, almost pleading wave. There's no urgency to his gesture, just a silent request, a lingering pull that beckons drivers to slow down, to offer him a ride. The locals all agree on one rule: if you see him, do not stop. Keep your eyes on the road, press down on the gas, and drive past him without a second glance. But as the legend tells it, some drivers can't resist. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's an unspoken sense of duty to help a stranger stranded in the middle of nowhere. Or perhaps it's simply the mysterious draw of his gaze, a look that seems to hold not only sorrow but a strange sort of understanding, as if he's seen more than any living soul could comprehend. For those who stop, the experience is unforgettable. At first, everything feels strangely normal. The hitchhiker slides into the passenger seat, silent and composed, his dark eyes fixed straight ahead. Drivers often report a heavy silence filling the car, as if he's brought the weight of the fog inside with him. Some try to ask him questions: where are you headed? Or are you okay out here all alone? But he never answers. He only sits, hands folded in his lap, his gaze distant and cold. But the longer he's in the car, the stranger things become. A chill begins to seep into the air, a numbing cold that feels as though it's crawling up from the floorboards, winding itself around the driver. No matter how high the heaters turned up, the cold persists, a cold that seems to come from somewhere far beyond this world. And when the driver finally dares to glance over, they'll see his reflection staring back in the side window, his eyes hollow, his expression frozen in an almost otherworldly calm. Then, without warning, he'll disappear. There's no flash of light, no sound, just an empty seat where moments before, he'd been sitting. And as he vanishes, a deep, chilling silence settles in, leaving the driver alone once more, grappling with a lingering feeling of dread. Those who've experienced it say the worst part isn't his disappearance, it's what follows. In the days after their encounter, they report strange occurrences: a persistent feeling of being watched, the unmistakable sensation of someone or something following close behind. Some claim to see his figure in their rearview mirror when they're alone at night, just a fleeting glimpse before it fades back into the shadows. Others say they hear faint whispers on the wind, a soft murmur that seems to echo the silent plea he'd conveyed in that initial wave by the roadside. And no matter how far they drive, how much time passes, they say they're never really free of him. Once you've seen the silent hitchhiker, the locals say, he becomes a part of you, a shadow that follows, a reminder of the road's haunted history that never fully fades. The stories spread, with each retelling adding layers of mystery and fear. As word of the hitchhiker's sightings circulated, the highway gained a reputation. Drivers began to avoid it at all costs, especially after dark. It wasn't just the unsettling fog or the eerie quiet that drove people away, it was the dread that lingered after an encounter. No one could explain who or what the hitchhiker was, but those who'd seen him shared a singular certainty: something unnatural had crossed their path. Still, there were always those who couldn't resist the temptation to test the legend. It was often the thrill seekers or the curious, people who dismissed the stories as superstitions or fabricated tales meant to scare. One night, a young couple, drawn to the idea of challenging the myth, decided to take a late-night drive down the infamous stretch of highway. They'd heard the rumors but figured it was just local folklore, nothing to be afraid of. As they cruised down the empty road, the air grew thick with mist. The headlights barely cut through the fog, and the trees on either side seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The woman, seated beside her boyfriend, tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over her. "It's just a road," she said, forcing a laugh. "Nothing to be afraid of." But her laughter faltered when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing at the side of the road. At first, she thought it was just another tree or an illusion, but as they drew closer, it became clear there was a person standing there, his hand raised in that unmistakable wave. Her heart skipped a beat. "You see that?" she whispered to her boyfriend, voice trembling. He glanced over, his face turning pale. "I see it. Don't stop. Don't stop the car." But the man's hand stayed outstretched, his motion deliberate, as if he was waiting for them to acknowledge him. A strange pull began to draw them in, an urge to stop that neither could explain. They could feel the weight of his gaze, even from a distance, as if he were watching them, studying them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the car seemed to slow of its own accord as they neared the figure. It wasn't until they were just a few feet away that they both simultaneously decided they couldn't just drive past. With a shaky breath, the boyfriend rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in, but it wasn't just cold, it was otherworldly, a chill that seemed to crawl under the skin and freeze the soul. The hitchhiker slowly turned toward them, and for the first time, they got a good look at his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and his eyes were sunken, hollow pits that seemed to stare right through them. His hair, dark and matted, hung loosely around his face, and his clothes were from another time, ragged but neatly pressed, as though he hadn't aged a day in years. He looked at them silently, a faint, empty smile playing on his lips, like someone who knew more than they should. The boyfriend's hand hovered over the gear shift, his instincts screaming at him to drive away, but the words he wanted to say caught in his throat. The woman felt the air around her grow thick, the weight of the silence pressing down on her chest. "Can I help you?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he slowly opened the passenger door, his movements unnaturally slow, deliberate. A wave of dread crashed over them both, but the boyfriend, gripped by an inexplicable urge, said, "Just get in. We'll take you to the next town." The hitchhiker didn't move. He stood there for a long moment, gazing at them with those empty, haunting eyes. Finally, his hand reached out, but it wasn't for the car. His finger pointed past them, toward the road ahead. Confused, the boyfriend turned his gaze to where the hitchhiker's finger was directed. There, just beyond the fog, the dim shape of someone moved. Another figure. This one was larger, more defined, but also wrong. There was something about its shape that made the blood run cold. The boyfriend looked back at the hitchhiker, but the seat beside him was now empty. The figure had vanished. His gaze darted around the car, heart pounding. There was nothing but the sound of their breathing, heavy and uneven. The woman looked at him, eyes wide. What was that? Before he could respond, the car jolted forward, as if something invisible had shoved them into motion. The fog seemed to close in tighter around them, and the road stretched on, empty and endless. Neither of them spoke as the miles slipped by, both of them trying to make sense of what had just happened. But in the back of their minds, they knew, they hadn't just picked up a hitchhiker. They had encountered something far darker, far more ancient, than they could understand. And as they sped through the night, they both felt the unmistakable presence of someone or something still watching them from the rearview mirror. And as they turned a corner, just before the fog swallowed the road completely, the whispers began. The whispers were faint at first, just a soft, almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to come from all around them. Neither of them spoke, too frightened to break the eerie silence that had descended in the car. It wasn't until the woman's hand grazed the door handle that she froze, her fingers tingling with a coldness she couldn't explain. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The boyfriend's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he peered into the rearview mirror, his knuckles white. The road behind them was still empty, the fog thick and impenetrable. But the whispers, they were growing louder now. The voices seemed to swirl around them, distant yet unmistakably close, echoing in the air like the murmurs of lost souls. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she turned to look out the side window. The trees outside had begun to bend unnaturally, as if they were reaching toward the car, their twisted branches creaking in the wind that wasn't there. Her heart raced as she turned back to her boyfriend, who was now speeding down the road, his eyes darting nervously from the road ahead to the rearview mirror. "I don't think we're alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He could feel it too, the creeping sensation that something was wrong, that they were being followed, that the road itself had become a trap. The whispers grew clearer, no longer just faint murmurs but distinct words, barely audible over the sound of the car's engine. "Turn back, turn back." The woman's eyes widened. She tried to shake the feeling off, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks, but deep down, she knew better. There was something sinister about the air around them, something that chilled her to the bone. Suddenly, the car lurched forward, jerking them both in their seats. The boyfriend slammed on the brakes, heart racing, eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, staring at the dashboard. Before he could react, the headlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the fog-covered road. The whispers grew louder still, now accompanied by soft, rhythmic thuds, like footsteps following them, growing closer with every passing second. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal again, but the car wouldn't move. It was as if the road had come alive, refusing to let them go. The woman grabbed his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. From the fog ahead, two figures emerged, moving slowly toward the car. At first, they appeared to be little more than shapes in the mist, but as they drew nearer, the details became more horrifying. One was the silent hitchhiker, his hollow eyes now glowing faintly in the moonlight. The other was far worse, a tall, gaunt figure, its face hidden in the shadows of its hood, dragging something heavy behind it. The boyfriend tried to start the car again, his hands shaking, but it was no use. The engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered one last time, illuminating the two figures standing just beyond the reach of the car's lights. The hitchhiker's smile had twisted into something grotesque, a sickening mockery of warmth, while the second figure stood motionless, the weight it dragged behind it scraping the ground with a dreadful screech. The whispers were now a cacophony in their ears, voices rising in frantic urgency, as if pleading for them to leave, but it was too late. The tall figure slowly raised its head, revealing a face that was little more than a grotesque mask of decay. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and its mouth, stretched too wide, opened slowly, letting out a chilling, inhuman sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The woman gasped, her hand clutching her boyfriend's arm so tightly it hurt. "We need to run." But even as she spoke, the air grew colder, the fog thicker, and the road around them seemed to close in, the trees now looming over the car like dark sentinels. In the distance, a faint, agonizing scream pierced the air. It wasn't just any scream, it was a cry of pure torment, the kind that echoes from the deepest corners of the soul. The hitchhiker slowly took a step forward, his feet barely touching the ground, gliding across the pavement with an unnatural smoothness. He extended a hand toward them, his fingers impossibly long, as if he were reaching out to claim them. "No, please," the woman whispered, her voice breaking as she trembled in terror. The boyfriend tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and he yanked on the handle again and again. "Why won't it open?" The second figure dragged its weight forward, the sound of the chains scraping along the road louder now, and as it reached the car, the fog swallowed the world around them. The last thing they saw was the hitchhiker's face, inches from the window, his hollow eyes gleaming with an unholy light. Then, all went dark. The next morning, the car was found abandoned, the engine still running but silent, the doors wide open. There was no sign of the young couple, only a trail of broken branches leading off into the dense woods. And on the seat of the car, resting perfectly still, was an old, weathered hitchhiker's jacket. The highway was quiet again. But some say if you listen carefully, you can still hear the whispers of those who dared to travel that cursed stretch of road. The morning sun filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows across the highway. The car, left eerily undisturbed, seemed to be a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded the night before. But to the locals, this was nothing new. Stories of strange disappearances along this road had been whispered for years, disappearances that no one had ever been able to explain. The sheriff's office received the call, a report of an abandoned vehicle on the side of the road. They dispatched a patrol car to the scene, but when the officers arrived, they were met with an unsettling sight. The car doors were wide open, as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air. The engine, still running, emitted a faint hum, and the faint smell of burning rubber lingered in the air, but there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no signs of a fight. They found the jacket on the seat, old and tattered, but with a fresh, unnatural odor that they couldn't place. It wasn't the scent of the road or the forest, it was something darker, a mix of decay and earth, like something that had been hidden for a very long time. The sheriff, an old man who had spent most of his life patrolling the woods and highways around this area, knew the stories. He had heard them all, the tales of the hitchhiker, the ones about the chains, the whispers in the fog. But he had always written them off as nothing more than local superstition, fueled by too many long nights and too much moonshine. But when he saw the car, and when he smelled that odd, pungent odor from the jacket, a chill ran down his spine. He ordered the officers to search the surrounding area, but they found nothing. No footprints. No signs of life. Just the woods quiet, untouched, and unnervingly still. As the day wore on, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He knew this road like the back of his hand, but it had always been a place of strange occurrences. The locals had always warned about the stretch of highway just beyond the gas station. They called it the haunting mile. And now, it seemed, the haunting had come for the young couple. Later that evening, the sheriff sat in his office, reviewing the case files of previous disappearances. One by one, the names jumped out at him, all had vanished under similar circumstances, all had been last seen near the same stretch of road, and most had been driving alone or with a companion. But none of them had been found. Not a trace, not a clue, not even a body. The families of the missing had been left with nothing but the unending pain of unanswered questions. The sheriff stood up, his heart heavy, and went to the window that overlooked the highway. The sun had set, and a thick fog had begun to roll in. It was an eerily familiar sight. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. But deep down, he knew. It wasn't over. The hitchhiker was still out there, waiting for his next victim. And the whispers in the fog would never stop. The sheriff reached for his hat, determined to find answers. He'd lived through all sorts of strange occurrences in his life, but this was different. This was something that wasn't going to be ignored anymore. As he stepped out of the office and into his patrol car, he noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, a man, dressed in a long coat, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The man stood perfectly still, motionless, like a statue waiting for something or someone. The sheriff's heart skipped a beat. He drove closer, his headlights cutting through the mist. The figure didn't move. It wasn't until he was just a few feet away that the man turned, his head slowly swiveling toward the patrol car. The sheriff slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The figure was gone. Just like that, as if the fog had swallowed him whole. He sat there for a moment, staring into the thick mist, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, a voice soft and distant whispered through the air. "Not everyone leaves this road. Sheriff." A shiver ran down the sheriff's spine, and without another word, he sped down the road, the fog now a thick blanket around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something or someone was just out of sight, following his every move. And then, in the distance, he saw it. The figure again. Standing at the side of the road, waiting. This time, the sheriff didn't stop. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal and raced past the figure, his pulse pounding in his ears. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty stretch of highway. But there it was, a face, pale and ghostly, staring at him from the mist. The hitchhiker's eyes, hollow and unblinking, locked onto his. And then, the voice again, chilling in its finality. "You can't run." The sheriff's grip on the wheel tightened, but he couldn't stop now. Not after what he had just seen, not after what he had just heard. The terror had become all too real. As the sheriff drove further into the fog, the whispers grew louder, the road stretching endlessly before him. And though he tried to push the fear from his mind, one thought lingered. He wasn't alone. The fog seemed to thicken the deeper the sheriff drove, until it enveloped his patrol car entirely. The beam from his headlights barely cut through the mist, and the road ahead appeared to stretch on forever, an endless expanse of darkness and shadows. His mind raced, piecing together the strange occurrences, the reports of missing people, the whispers, and now the hitchhiker, the figure that seemed to materialize from the very fog itself. He glanced nervously in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man again, his ghostly face still haunting his every thought. But the mirror revealed nothing, just the swirling mist behind him, creeping up on his tail, as if the fog itself was alive, chasing him. For a moment, the sheriff allowed himself a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He knew the stories. He had grown up hearing them from the locals, the tales of the silent hitchhiker, the figure that appeared on this stretch of highway, only to vanish into the fog or to lead drivers into fates far worse than they could imagine. But they had always been dismissed as mere superstition, folklore to scare the children. Now, with every passing second, he was beginning to believe in those old stories more than ever before. Then, the radio crackled to life, snapping him from his thoughts. "Sheriff, you copy?" It was his deputy, Tom, calling from the station. The voice was shaky, as if something was weighing heavily on the young deputy's mind. "Sheriff, you need to get back here. We just got another report someone saw the hitchhiker again. Same spot, same description. The other deputies, they're not sure what to make of it." The sheriff's stomach dropped. The hitchhiker was back, and Tom sounded spooked, more so than usual. "Stay where you are, deputy. I'm on my way back." He tried to sound confident, but even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late, that something was waiting for him just ahead. As he turned the wheel to head back toward the station, a faint shadow appeared in the distance, barely visible through the fog. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the mist, just a trick of his mind, but then the figure became clearer, standing at the side of the road, eerily still, just like the last time. He slammed his foot on the brake, his heart racing. The figure stood there, too calm, too motionless. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat as he slowed to a stop just a few feet away. The figure didn't move. "Get out of there," the sheriff screamed through the windshield, not knowing if he was addressing the figure or himself. But there was no answer, no response from the shadowy figure. The only sound was the eerie whistle of the wind weaving through the trees and the subtle creaking of the car's brakes. Then, the hitchhiker turned. Slowly, his head lifted, his eyes meeting the sheriff's through the windshield. His face was pale, drained of all color, and his eyes, they were empty, just dark, hollow sockets that seemed to reach into the sheriff's soul, pulling him in. The sheriff's hands clenched around the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. The figure's stare was unyielding. And then, without a sound, the hitchhiker raised his hand, a long, bony finger pointing toward the sheriff. The sheriff froze, heart hammering. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. His fingers twitched, reaching instinctively for the door handle, but then the figure spoke, its voice distant, but clear as day. "You were warned." Before the sheriff could react, the figure vanished. It was as though the fog had swallowed him whole, his presence fading from the road as quickly as it had come. The sheriff sat there, staring into the empty space where the figure had been. His pulse raced, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He had heard the stories, yes, but nothing had prepared him for this. With a shaky hand, he reached for his radio. "Tom, you still there?" There was no response. He tried again, a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. But the static on the other end was deafening. The radio had gone silent. He cursed under his breath. The sheriff's eyes darted around, searching for the figure, for any sign of movement in the fog, but there was nothing, just the thick, suffocating mist and the distant rustle of the trees. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones, a growing sense of dread settling deep into his gut. He had seen the hitchhiker. He had heard his words. And yet, there was no sign of him now. What had he meant? "You were warned." He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The sheriff slammed the patrol car into gear and sped back toward the station. His eyes remained glued to the road ahead, scanning the fog for any sign of the figure or anything out of place. But as he drove, the feeling of being watched crept over him, suffocating. Every dark corner, every fleeting shadow seemed to be hiding something, watching him as he passed by. And then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. A shape. A figure. Standing at the side of the road. The hitchhiker. Again. This time, there was no turning back. The sheriff's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the pressure. His heart raced, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he sped down the road, the figure in his rearview mirror never leaving his sight. It was as if the hitchhiker had followed him, materializing again just when he thought he had escaped. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes darting to the side of the road where the figure had appeared. The dark silhouette was still there, standing motionless as though time itself had stopped. The sheriff's instincts screamed at him to drive faster, to escape whatever curse had gripped this stretch of highway, but something held him in place, an unshakable, terrifying force compelling him to look back. His eyes caught the figure's form again, and this time, he saw it more clearly. The hitchhiker was closer, almost as though he had moved without the sheriff noticing, his features becoming sharper and more defined. The pale skin, the hollow eyes, nothing about the figure seemed natural. It was the way he stood, unnervingly still, that made the sheriff's blood run cold. The sheriff's pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, trying to outrun the figure, but the fog seemed to stretch ahead endlessly. No matter how fast he drove, the figure remained, always at the edge of his vision, haunting him in the rearview mirror. As the sheriff reached a bend in the road, he saw the hitchhiker's form again, only now it was directly in his path. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car slid to a halt mere inches from the figure. The air around him seemed to thicken, as though the very fog was alive, pressing in from all sides. The figure was now inches from the front of the car, his dark eyes staring into the sheriff's, unblinking. The temperature in the car dropped sharply, and for a moment, the sheriff could almost see his breath fogging in the cold air. The figure tilted his head slowly, the movement unnervingly deliberate. And then, with a voice that seemed to come from all around him, the hitchhiker spoke again. "You shouldn't have come back." The sheriff's chest tightened, a wave of nausea crashing over him. He had heard the stories, the ones that the locals whispered about the hitchhiker, how anyone who encountered him was doomed to face a fate worse than death. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality standing in front of him now. With a trembling hand, the sheriff reached for his radio once more, but the static filled his ears, louder than before, an oppressive hum that drowned out any attempt to communicate. The figure began to move, its skeletal form shifting unnaturally close to the windshield. The sheriff froze, unable to look away, unable to do anything but watch as the figure raised a finger to his lips in a chilling, silent gesture. SHH. Suddenly, the hitchhiker began to fade, his form dissipating into the thick fog as if swallowed by the night. The sheriff's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shaky and shallow. He was alone again, the fog closing in around him, the silence deafening. For a long moment, the sheriff sat motionless, unsure whether to breathe or scream. He had seen it with his own eyes, the hitchhiker, the warning. His mind raced to understand what had just happened. Was he truly alone? Or was something following him, something far worse than he could comprehend? He reached for the door handle, stepping out of the car slowly, the cold air biting into his skin as he surveyed the empty stretch of road. The fog had begun to roll back, revealing nothing but the endless road ahead. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of the pale, silent man who had haunted him so. But the sheriff knew, deep down, that he wasn't free of him, not yet. He had felt it, the curse of the hitchhiker. And now, the road ahead was his only escape. But for how long? As he turned back to the car, he caught a faint glimpse in the distance just beyond the fog, just out of reach. Another figure. The sheriff's blood ran cold. The hitchhiker wasn't done with him yet. The sheriff's heart skipped a beat, his feet frozen in place as he turned back toward his patrol car. He stared into the mist, trying to discern the figure's shape in the growing fog. It was barely visible, just a shadow, shifting against the haze, but unmistakably human. He instinctively took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. The figure wasn't moving, at least not yet. It was standing still, but he knew it wouldn't remain that way for long. With a shaky breath, the sheriff stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as he slowly approached the car. The air felt heavier now, thick with the tension that had settled over the road like a blanket. The silence stretched on, suffocating and complete, until it was broken by the faintest sound, faint, but unmistakable. A whisper. "You can't outrun me." The sheriff's blood ran cold. He spun toward the voice, his eyes scanning the fog-drenched road, but there was no one there. Not at first. Then, just at the edge of his vision, the figure appeared again, closer this time, moving toward him with a slow, deliberate gait. The sheriff's instincts screamed at him to run, to get back in his car and drive, but he couldn't move. It was as though something invisible had a hold on him, keeping him rooted to the spot. The figure, tall and gaunt, stepped into view, its dark eyes locking onto the sheriff's. The hitchhiker's face was eerily pale, his features sharp and hollow, like something that had been dead far too long to still resemble a living human being. His lips curled into an unsettling smile as he took another step forward. "You shouldn't have returned," the figure said, his voice raspy, but clear. "Once you've seen me, you can never leave." The sheriff's throat tightened. He tried to speak, tried to call out for help, but no words came. His body felt heavy, as if the very air itself was pressing down on him, suffocating him. The figure took another step. And then another. The sheriff could feel his heart racing faster, the panic rising in his chest. He had to do something, anything. He couldn't just stand there. But his legs refused to obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmarish encounter. "This road is mine," the hitchhiker whispered, his voice dropping lower. "And so are you." The sheriff's eyes darted to his patrol car. The keys were still inside. He could make a run for it. But every step he took toward the car felt like an eternity, each one harder than the last, as though something was holding him back, keeping him tethered to this cursed stretch of highway. And then, just as he was about to break free, the hitchhiker vanished. One moment he was there, standing directly in front of the sheriff, his cold eyes staring deep into his soul, and the next, gone. As if swallowed by the fog itself. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat. He stood there, trembling, staring at the empty stretch of road before him. No figure. No hitchhiker. Just the oppressive fog, swirling around him like a living thing, taunting him, daring him to run. But he couldn't. Not anymore. The figure was gone, yes, but the curse remained. The sheriff turned and rushed back to his patrol car, the engine roaring to life as he threw it in reverse and slammed his foot on the gas. His headlights cut through the thick fog, the road before him now a blur of shadows. He couldn't escape fast enough. His hands gripped the wheel so tight that his knuckles ached. Every glance in the rearview mirror, every shadow in the corner of his eye, sent chills down his spine. He could still feel the hitchhiker's presence, watching him. "You can never leave." The sheriff didn't know if the words were in his head or if they had come from the hitchhiker's lips. But the message was clear. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened here, he was now a part of it. And there was no escaping the road. He didn't know how far he drove. The miles seemed to stretch on endlessly, the fog pressing in from every side, the headlights illuminating nothing but an endless void. The radio crackled to life, the static buzzing loudly in his ears, and then just before he could make out the voice, his car slammed to a halt. The road in front of him was blocked. A figure stood in the middle of the highway, bathed in the pale glow of the headlights. It wasn't the hitchhiker this time. This figure was different. Taller, more imposing. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. He didn't need to see the face. He knew what it was. A ghost. Another one. The road was never meant to be traveled. The sheriff's foot hovered above the brake, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to drive, to turn around, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His hands gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles white, yet his feet stayed frozen. The figure in front of him didn't move, its form standing tall and immovable, like an ancient sentinel, guarding the cursed stretch of road. The air inside the car grew colder, and the fog outside thickened, swirling in ghostly tendrils that seemed to reach for him. The sheriff could barely breathe as the silence pressed in on him, suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears. "You should never have returned." The voice was different this time. Deeper, more resonant, like the whisper of the wind itself, carried through the mist. The sheriff's gaze locked onto the figure taller than any man he'd ever seen, its outline blurred by the fog. The figure was dressed in something old, its clothes dark and flowing like a cloak, and it stood perfectly still, almost waiting. For what? The sheriff didn't know. But his feet refused to move, and every part of his body screamed to get away. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took one slow, deliberate step toward him. Each movement seemed deliberate, measured, as though it was walking through time itself. The fog parted around it, and for a split second, the sheriff saw something that made his stomach churn. Behind the figure's veil of mist, a face appeared. Faint at first, but then clearer, like an image forming from the darkness itself. The face was pale, its features twisted in agony, the eyes wide with an expression of sheer terror. The sheriff gasped, the blood draining from his face. He recognized it. He had seen that face before, in the mirror, in his dreams. It was the face of the man he had sworn to protect, one of the lost souls who had vanished from this road years ago. The sheriff had seen the stories in the local archives, the disappearances, the strange reports, the missing people whose last known locations were always on this very highway. He had always dismissed them as rumors, as fabrications to explain the unexplainable. But now, staring at the ghostly face before him, he understood. They weren't stories. They were warnings. The figure took another step forward, the ground beneath it trembling with the weight of its presence. The sheriff's car vibrated, the air thickening with energy, as if the very road itself was alive. The fog seemed to pulse with every movement, as though something was about to break free from the depths of the earth. "You're here," the figure whispered again, the words clearer this time. "You're already a part of this road now." The sheriff finally snapped out of his trance. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life, but the car didn't move. It was stuck. No matter how much pressure he applied to the pedal, the tires spun uselessly on the road. The figure took another step, closing the distance between them. Panic surged through the sheriff. He yanked the wheel hard, his eyes darting around for any possible way out. There was none. His rear-view mirror reflected nothing but more fog, swirling like a storm behind him. And ahead? The figure was so close now that the sheriff could feel the coldness emanating from it, his breath freezing in the air. With one final, desperate push, the sheriff forced the car into reverse. The tires screeched, burning rubber, and the car jerked back several feet before finally catching traction. He turned the wheel sharply, gunning the engine, speeding away as fast as he could manage. The mist seemed to chase him, thick and relentless, swallowing the road behind him. His eyes darted back, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the highway stretched out in eerie silence, empty save for the sound of his engine roaring in the night. He didn't know how far he drove. The miles blurred into each other, the fog never lifting. The sheriff's mind raced, the image of that ghostly face burned into his mind. He had been warned. He had been drawn into something far darker than he had ever realized. And no matter how fast he drove, he knew there was no escaping it. The road was watching. The hitchhikers, the ghosts, they were all a part of it now. And one way or another, they always came back. "You can never leave." The sheriff's grip tightened on the wheel. He glanced into the rearview mirror one last time, his breath freezing in his chest when he saw nothing but fog, and then, for the briefest moment, a figure in the distance, standing at the side of the road, waiting. Waiting for someone else. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white as the figure drew closer. His pulse thundered in his ears, louder than the hum of the engine. The man, if that's what he was, moved with a strange fluidity, too perfect, too deliberate. Each step seemed unnaturally synchronized, as though he were gliding, hovering just inches above the ground. The tires of James's truck hummed against the asphalt, the only other sound in the eerie stillness. With every inch closer the figure got, the temperature inside the truck seemed to drop. James's breath fogged up the windshield, the cold creeping up his spine like icy fingers. He tried to look away, to speed off into the night, but his body refused to obey. His eyes locked onto the hitchhiker, drawn to him as if some invisible force was compelling him to stay. The truck's headlights cast sharp shadows across the figure's face, and that's when James saw it. The hitchhiker's eyes were black, wide, and unblinking, as though they had no whites at all, just empty, dark voids. A shiver ran down his back, and the metallic scent of old iron seemed to fill the cab. Then came the sound, a soft, almost inaudible rattle, like the faint clinking of chains or the quiet jangle of keys. The noise wasn't coming from the truck, but from the figure himself, who had stopped just inches from the door. It was as though the hitchhiker carried some unspoken weight, some burden that made his presence even more unsettling. The click of the door handle echoed in the quiet night. A strange chill washed over James, one that went deeper than just the temperature drop. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment, he felt paralyzed, like the truck itself had become a tomb with no escape. The figure's hand hovered just above the door, fingers twitching slightly, as though hesitating, waiting for James to make a choice. The hitchhiker's lips curled into a small, unsettling smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through James. He couldn't tell if it was the man's intent to harm, or something far worse, but there was no denying that something was deeply wrong about the entire situation. Time stretched, becoming thick and suffocating. The world around him seemed to stop, suspended in a moment of dread. The miles of road that lay behind him, the lives he'd lived, the miles ahead, they all seemed to disappear as his focus narrowed to the figure and the door. Would you have rolled down the window, heard the man's voice, perhaps even let him in? Or would you have slammed the truck into gear and sped away, hoping to outrun the oppressive feeling hanging thick in the air? James's hand hovered over the door handle, the cold metal sending a jolt of panic through his veins. The hitchhiker stood there, motionless now, but somehow, his presence felt larger, like he was filling up every corner of the truck with his dark energy. James's heart raced, each beat a thunderous echo in the silence of the night. The air seemed heavier now, as though it were pressing in on him from all sides. He glanced down at the rearview mirror, but all he could see was a wall of fog that had gathered thick behind him. The road was empty, no other vehicles, no lights in the distance, nothing but the dense, suffocating mist that seemed to close in, swallowing the world whole. He could feel the weight of the moment, like something terrible was waiting just beyond the truck's frame, something that would be unleashed if he made the wrong move. The hitchhiker's hand twitched again, a slight shift of the fingers, and James felt an icy chill creep over him. The rattle of chains, barely audible but unmistakable, reached his ears again. It sounded closer now, like it was coming from inside the truck, inside his mind. He could almost feel the scrape of metal against the floorboards, the weight of an unseen presence pressing against the truck's doors. Suddenly, the hitchhiker moved. It wasn't a simple step forward, it was almost as if he floated toward the door. One moment, he was standing just a few feet away, and the next, he was right next to the window, his face just beyond the glass. James flinched, heart leaping in his chest. The man's face, half obscured by the fog, was still. There was no movement, no sign of breath, just the hollow, suffocating blackness of his eyes staring directly into James's. He felt a wave of nausea surge through him. This wasn't a person, not in the way he understood people. This thing had no warmth, no humanity. Its gaze pierced through him, unblinking, as though it was studying him like prey. Then, the hitchhiker spoke, and the voice that came from his lips wasn't what James had expected. It wasn't deep or commanding, but a soft whisper, barely audible over the rattle of the chains and the wind howling outside the truck. "I'm just looking for a ride," he said, his voice uncomfortably calm, too calm. "But I'm not going to make it easy for you." James's breath hitched. The words didn't make sense. What was this man talking about? What did he mean, not going to make it easy for you? His thoughts spiraled, tangled in confusion and terror. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him, and in that moment, every part of him screamed, "Drive, drive now, get out of here." But his hand wouldn't move. The hitchhiker's eyes remained locked on his, drawing him in, making him feel as though he was stuck frozen in place by the pressure of that unblinking stare. The click of the door handle sounded louder now, like a signal, an invitation, or a threat. James's instincts screamed at him to run, but something held him in place. The hitchhiker, still staring, began to smile, a slow, chilling stretch of lips that made James's blood run cold. "You can't run, James. You're already in my grip." The truck seemed to shudder beneath him. The fog outside thickened, swirling with unnatural speed, as if it too had a mind of its own. James's chest tightened, his breath shallow, as he realized the hitchhiker knew his name. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was something more. Would you have opened the door, feeling the weight of the moment crush down on you, the strange familiarity of the voice sending you into a state of fearful curiosity? Or would you have floored the gas pedal, hoping to escape whatever dark thing had found you on that deserted road? James's mind reeled, unable to comprehend what was happening. The hitchhiker's smile deepened, his lips pulling back as he took one slow step back. But before James could even react, the fog surged forward, covering the truck in a dense veil. And in that moment, everything went dark. The truck's engine sputtered, a low, unnatural sound, as though it, too, was unsure whether it wanted to keep running. The world outside the window had vanished into an impenetrable white and endless wall of fog. The figure outside was no longer visible, but James couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting just out of sight, hovering just beyond his reach. The cold that had seeped into the cab grew sharper, almost biting. It wasn't the typical chill of a foggy night, this was something otherworldly, as though the very air had turned against him. His skin crawled. The chains, the ones James could still faintly hear, seemed to rattle from all directions now, reverberating through the truck like they were coming from inside the engine itself, from the very wheels that were still rolling, turning, moving him forward despite his instinct to stop. Then came the soft tapping at the window. James froze. He didn't even want to look. But his neck strained, against his will, his body betraying him as his eyes turned toward the side mirror. The tapping, at first, had been so quiet, like a fingernail scraping against glass. But now, it was growing louder, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone or something was trying to get his attention. His heart slammed in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears as he fought against the compulsion to glance at the window. But it was no use. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. With every beat of his heart, the tapping grew louder, each strike a jagged slice of sound through the thick fog. A strange warmth spread across his face, and James realized he was sweating, his hands slick on the steering wheel. His breath came in shallow gasps, his palms clammy as he gripped the wheel tighter. His eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the side window, as if he couldn't decide which one to focus on. The hitchhiker's presence loomed like a shadow over him, even though the figure itself was nowhere to be seen. Then there it was. A pale face appeared, pressed up against the glass. James's stomach dropped. The face was distorted, unnaturally thin, as though it had been stretched or melted, the features sharp and unfamiliar. The eyes were black, pitch black, with no whites visible at all, just two empty voids staring directly at him. And though the mouth didn't move, James could feel the words in his mind, hear them echo in the deepest part of his consciousness. "You can't escape me, James. You never could." His vision blurred as he reached for the door handle, his fingers numb and trembling. He needed to get out of the truck, needed to run, but every part of him was paralyzed. The creature outside, the thing in the fog, knew him. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. His legs felt like lead, frozen in place, and for a moment, he wondered if his body had betrayed him completely. The fog swirled violently now, closing in around him like it had a mind of its own. The windows were so fogged up, he could barely see through them. The tapping at the window grew faster, more erratic. A cold breath brushed against the glass, leaving behind a frosty imprint in the shape of a hand. A hand that didn't belong to him. The truck jerked as though something heavy had slammed into the side. James's heart lurched. The steering wheel slipped from his grip, and the truck veered dangerously toward the shoulder of the road. His grip on the wheel tightened again, his knuckles white with fear, as he fought to maintain control. Keep driving, his mind screamed. But no matter how hard he pushed on the accelerator, it felt like the truck was sinking into the fog, like the fog itself was alive, swallowing the truck whole. And then, without warning, the fog lifted just enough to reveal the road ahead. But it wasn't the road James recognized. The landscape had changed completely. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching up like skeletal fingers, and the moon was now a sickly yellow, casting an eerie glow across the barren landscape. The truck was no longer on a familiar highway. It was on a path he didn't know, an old, winding road that seemed to stretch into nothingness. And standing in the middle of that road, under the ghostly moonlight, was the hitchhiker. Would you have dared to drive toward him again, or would you have turned back, knowing that turning back might be the very thing that seals your fate? The hitchhiker's form was now clearer, his eyes hollow and black as the night itself, staring at James with an intensity that made him question everything. Was this a nightmare? Or something far worse? The truck's engine sputtered, then died silent and final. It was a late autumn night, and the road ahead stretched out endlessly, dark and empty. Emily had been driving for hours, the silence of the car broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind. She had been on this long journey to her aunt's house, intending to arrive before midnight, but the thick fog rolling in had slowed her down significantly, and now she found herself hopelessly lost in the middle of nowhere. The dense fog clung to the sides of the road like a living thing, swallowing up everything in sight beyond the dim glow of her headlights. Her GPS had long since lost signal. The screen had gone blank, then flickered back to life only to give her a loading circle that seemed to taunt her. She wasn't sure which direction to take anymore, left, right, back. Every turn felt the same. She hadn't seen another car for miles. In a way, the solitude was comforting. No traffic. No distractions. Just the hum of her tires on the wet road, the fog thickening with every passing minute. But, in another, more unsettling way, it felt wrong. She knew she was getting farther from civilization, but the reality of it didn't quite hit her until she glanced at the rearview mirror and realized the car she thought had been behind her had vanished, leaving her alone in the abyss. A sudden gust of wind rattled the car, shaking her from her thoughts. She tightened her grip on the wheel, eyes narrowing against the fog. The road ahead seemed endless. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going, but there was no turning back now. Then, out of nowhere, something in the distance caught her eye, a dark figure standing on the side of the road. At first, she thought it was a trick of the fog. A tree branch. A shadow. But no. As she drove closer, she realized it was a person standing completely still by the side of the road. The figure was barely visible through the mist, just a dark silhouette against the pale, swirling fog. A hitchhiker. Her heart skipped a beat. There was something eerie about the figure, the way they stood there, unmoving. She hadn't seen another soul for hours, and now, here was someone, waiting. She hadn't planned on stopping for anyone, not in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, surrounded by nothing but fog. Yet, something about the figure seemed to draw her in. The closer she got, the more her pulse quickened. She had heard all the warnings: never pick up strangers on the road, especially at night, but this wasn't just any stranger. There was something wrong with him. The air seemed to grow heavier as she approached, and the figure didn't shift, didn't move a muscle. It was as though he had been standing there for an eternity, waiting. Emily slowed the car, instinctively rolling down the window a crack, her hand hovering uneasily over the door handle. Her fingers felt cold, despite the warmth in the car. As the truck crept closer, she could see the figure more clearly, a man, tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, the collar turned up against the chill of the night. His face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, but his presence was undeniable, like a pull on her very soul. It felt like he had been watching her for longer than she'd been aware. Then, just as she prepared to pass him by, the figure turned his head. Slowly. Methodically. His face was still hidden, but it felt like he was staring directly into her eyes. There was no expression, no hint of surprise or urgency, just a cold, emotionless stare. A stare that somehow made her blood run cold, a stare that felt like it had the power to see into her very soul. Against every instinct she had, Emily rolled the window down further, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Do you need a ride?" Her breath came out in small clouds in the chilled air, the fog now creeping into the car with every passing second. The figure didn't respond immediately. The seconds stretched out, unbearably long, until, finally, he nodded. It wasn't an enthusiastic or grateful gesture, it was a slow, deliberate motion, like he had been waiting for her to ask. Then, he stepped closer. His movements were unnervingly smooth, almost gliding across the road rather than walking, like a predator closing in on its prey. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood up. She could feel her pulse thudding in her ears. She should have driven away. She should have trusted her instincts to get out of there, but instead, she sat frozen, staring at him. There was no reason for it, no logical reason why she felt so compelled to let him in. But the fog around them thickened as if to seal off all possible escape. His hand stretched toward the door. The sound of his fingers tapping against the glass made Emily's heart skip a beat. The soft click of his hand against the handle sent a tremor through her spine. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and soft, as though the wind itself had carried the words to her. But there was no warmth in his voice. No gratitude. Just a quiet, hollow tone that made her stomach twist. As the door swung open, she didn't dare look at his face. She kept her gaze forward, staring at the empty road that seemed to stretch forever, the fog closing in tighter around them. The man slid into the seat next to her, his movements so fluid, so unnatural, it made her skin crawl. There was no smell of damp clothes or cold air, nothing that spoke of a man who had been standing out in the fog for hours. Just a suffocating silence that filled the car as he settled in beside her. And in the thickening darkness, as Emily's hands shook on the wheel, she couldn't help but wonder, who or what had she just invited into her car? Emily could feel the weight of the man's presence next to her, as though his very being was pressing down on the car. The silence between them felt suffocating, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the muffled whoosh of the wind outside. The air in the car had grown unnaturally cold, and Emily's breath fogged up the windshield, despite the heater still running. She stole a glance at him, trying to make out any details, but his face was still hidden in the shadow of the hood. She couldn't even see his eyes, but she felt them too cold, unseen orbs that seemed to be watching her every move. Her skin prickled under his invisible gaze, and her grip on the steering wheel tightened. For a moment, she thought about asking him where he was headed, just to break the eerie silence, but the words lodged in her throat. The idea of speaking to him, of acknowledging him further, felt wrong. The air around him seemed to absorb sound, like he didn't belong in the world of the living. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The fog outside had thickened even more, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Emily couldn't see anything beyond the headlights now. The road stretched out ahead of her like an endless, dark tunnel, swallowed by the mist. She had no idea where she was anymore, or how much further it was to her aunt's house. The GPS was still dead, and the only direction she had left was the road itself, twisting, winding, endless. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure why she had asked. She wasn't even sure she wanted to know. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. The man didn't respond at first, and the silence seemed to grow heavier, almost suffocating. She glanced over at him again, her heart racing in her chest. His face was still hidden, and he made no move to speak. His stillness unnerved her. "Are you okay?" she tried again, her voice shaking this time. She had to know something, anything, to make sense of the surreal situation. But the question hung in the air like a ghost, unanswered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was deep, unnervingly calm, but it held an echo of something ancient, something otherworldly. "I'm where I need to be," he said. The words didn't quite make sense, and they hung there in the air like a riddle she couldn't solve. Emily's stomach turned. That wasn't an answer. It wasn't even an answer she wanted to hear. But the unease she felt seemed to dissolve the moment the words left his lips, as if he had somehow set the rules of this encounter. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves, but they seemed to betray her with every passing second. The fog outside was thick enough now that she could barely make out the lines of the road. Her headlights flickered briefly, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch across the empty landscape. Then, just as quickly, the lights went dim, leaving her in near complete darkness. Panic surged through her chest. Before she could react, the man spoke again, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Don't be afraid," he said, as though reading her thoughts. "I'm not going to hurt you." But it wasn't his words that unsettled her, it was the way he said them. His voice had an echo, a vibration that seemed to reverberate in the back of her mind, deep in her subconscious. As if it wasn't just him speaking, but something else, something older and far more sinister. Her hands trembled on the wheel. She felt an overwhelming urge to pull over, to stop and flee. But she couldn't. She was paralyzed, locked in place, as though his presence had seeped into her very being. Suddenly, the man's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, and placed itself on the armrest between them. The touch was icy cold, sending a shock through her body. Her breath hitched, and she nearly swerved the car off the road, but somehow, she managed to keep control. The sensation of his hand, no, his presence felt like it was wrapping around her chest, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. "I didn't ask for this," Emily whispered, half to herself, but the words seemed to reach him. "You never do," the man replied, his voice a soft rasp in the darkness. There was a finality in his tone, like a truth she didn't want to hear. The fog outside thickened even more, now pressing in on all sides like the walls of a claustrophobic trap. Emily's headlights barely cut through it, casting strange, flickering shadows on the road ahead. The world felt too small, too suffocating, and every instinct in her body screamed to stop the car, to throw it into reverse, to get away. But something kept her rooted in place. "Please," she muttered, "just tell me where we're going." For the first time, the man moved. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the outline of his face beneath the hood. There was something wrong with it, something wrong with him. His lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Where we're going," he said slowly, "you'll never leave." The temperature inside the car dropped even further, the cold seeping into her bones as though the man's presence was drawing all the warmth out of the world. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her fingers numb and stiff. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand on end, an icy shiver running down her spine. She tried to focus, to make sense of the situation, but every rational thought seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. The silence between them felt like a thick, impenetrable fog, just like the one that surrounded them outside. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she glanced at the man again. His face was still obscured by the shadow of his hood, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and unblinking, boring into her soul. She wanted to look away, to turn her gaze back to the road ahead, but she couldn't. Something kept her locked in that eerie, unnatural stare. Her thoughts raced, frantically trying to piece together why she hadn't driven off. Why she hadn't run the moment she saw him standing there, alone in the fog. She had heard the warnings, the stories about hitchhikers, about how they could be dangerous, even deadly. But it wasn't just fear that held her in place, it was a strange, magnetic pull. Like she needed to know where he came from, why he was here. The man's voice broke through the tension, soft, smooth, and unsettling. "You didn't ask, did you?" he said, his words like a whisper that seemed to vibrate against her skin. "Not where I came from, not where we're going." A shudder ran through Emily. "What do you mean?" she breathed out, her voice barely a sound, lost in the oppressive air. He leaned in slightly, his breath chilling the air between them. "There are places," he continued, each word deliberate, his voice dripping with a dark gravity, "that you can't leave once you've stepped inside. Places, where time stands still, and people are forgotten." She felt her stomach twist, her mind refusing to process what he was saying. She had to focus. She had to keep the car moving, but her eyes were drawn to the road, which was now barely visible. The fog had closed in so thickly that the headlights only illuminated a few feet ahead, casting long, eerie shadows in every direction. The trees lining the road seemed to loom closer, their silhouettes twisting in the haze like looming sentinels. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming faster as the air around her grew heavier with every passing second. She had to do something. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice now sharp with fear, though she didn't know if it was the man's presence or the growing sense of dread creeping over her that made the words tremble from her lips. For a moment, the man didn't answer. The silence seemed to stretch out like a living thing, suffocating, all-consuming. Then, in a voice so soft, so chilling, it sent a wave of nausea through her, he whispered, "To the place where you're meant to be." A cold chill settled over Emily, deeper than before, a gnawing feeling in her gut that told her she wasn't driving down a road, but down some twisted, uncharted path. Something was wrong. The world outside was wrong. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp as the fog pressed closer, thicker. She could feel the pull, the tug on her mind, her senses blurring. Her hands shook as she tried to steer, but the car felt as if it were moving slower than it should, the wheels struggling to grip the wet pavement. She looked at the rearview mirror, nothing but fog. The road stretched on endlessly, the same haunting white mist swirling in the headlights, but no matter how far she drove, nothing seemed to change. It felt like she was stuck in a loop, a never-ending void. The fog swallowed everything, leaving her trapped in it. She glanced back at the man beside her. His hand was resting calmly on the door, his fingers unmoving, but his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, seemed to burn into her. She felt his gaze pierce through the fog, deeper than the night around them. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that made her question whether he was truly human at all. "I can't," she began, but her voice trailed off. The words felt impossible to speak. She wanted to demand that he get out, that she get away from this nightmare. But her voice wouldn't obey her. "Do you see it now?" The man's voice had changed, deeper, more resonant, as if it came from everywhere at once. "This road, it leads only one way." The car slowed even more, and Emily slammed her foot on the gas pedal, desperate to break free, but the engine sputtered. She tried again, nothing. The car refused to move faster. The fog thickened, engulfing them completely, until she couldn't even see the edge of the road. Her eyes flickered to the side, and she saw, just for a moment, the figure of a woman standing in the distance, her face blurred, her figure faint, vanishing like a shadow in the fog. She blinked, and the woman was gone. Emily's heart skipped. Panic surged through her, and she jerked the wheel to the side. But before she could pull over or change course, the fog seemed to shift. The road ahead opened into an impossibly wide stretch, like a tunnel, and the car glided forward, its wheels no longer touching the pavement. They were floating, suspended in time, and the fog was inside the car now. "Where are we?" she gasped, her voice quivering. The man, still with that same eerie calm, looked at her again, his eyes as dark and hollow as a pit. "Welcome home," he said softly. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel with a vice-like grip, her palms slick with sweat. Her heart hammered in her chest as the car moved forward, pulled by some unseen force. The road ahead stretched on, endless, and the fog pressed in around her like a living entity. The trees that lined the road had vanished, swallowed by the mist, leaving no indication of direction, no landmarks, nothing to hold onto. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she glanced at the man beside her. His presence was suffocating, the air around him heavy with something unnatural. His eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, never left her, and with each passing moment, Emily could feel her grip on reality slipping. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, like he was drawing something from her, something deep inside, something she couldn't understand. The car seemed to move faster now, as if it were no longer under her control. "You can't escape," the man whispered, his voice lilting with a strange, haunting melody. "There's no turning back once you've seen the path. It knows you." Emily's pulse raced, her mind fighting to grasp onto some form of reason. "What do you mean? What is this?" Her voice trembled, the words nearly caught in her throat. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, his hand slowly moved to the door handle, his fingers brushing the cold metal. "This place," he began, his voice growing even softer, "has claimed many who passed through it. Some by their own choice, others, by fate." Fate. The word echoed in her mind, clashing against her growing panic. The fog thickened, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as the world outside the car seemed to warp. The headlights flickered, casting strange shadows on the now distant trees. She had to do something. She had to escape. The strange vision. Her foot slammed down on the gas pedal, but the car didn't respond the way it should have. The engine sputtered, as if it were struggling, and the speedometer remained frozen, as though the car was trapped in some unspoken, timeless space. Emily's chest tightened with fear as she looked at the rearview mirror again, only, this time, she didn't see the familiar stretch of road behind her. Instead, she saw the figure of a woman. A woman who looked just like her. The woman's face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror. She was running, her figure blurry and fading in the mirror as though she was being pulled away. Emily's throat tightened as she gasped, unable to tear her eyes away from the reflection. The woman in the mirror moved closer, her outstretched hand pressing against the glass, as if begging for help. "No!" Emily screamed, slamming her foot down harder on the gas. "What's happening?" The car jerked violently, but it didn't speed up. The fog closed in tighter, and the temperature inside the car dropped sharply, her breath coming out in visible puffs. Emily's hands trembled on the wheel, but she couldn't look away from the mirror, where the woman's hand now pressed against the glass, her fingers scraping, leaving behind long, dark streaks. It was as if the reflection was fighting to escape the glass. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the woman in the mirror vanished. The reflection returned to normal. Emily blinked, not sure if it had all been a hallucination or if something far more sinister was at play. The man beside her was still silent, watching her, his lips barely curling into a smile that seemed all too knowing. "You don't see them yet," he said cryptically, his voice low and rich with dark amusement. "See who?" Emily demanded, panic now flooding her veins. What are you talking about? The man chuckled softly, his breath almost a hiss in the still air. The ones who've come before you. The ones who have driven this road and never returned. The ones whose souls are now part of the path. You see them in the reflection. In the mirror. They're all around. The realization. Emily's hands clenched tighter on the wheel. She wasn't just lost in the fog. She was in something worse, something far worse. She realized, with growing horror, that the road she was on no longer felt like it was part of the world she knew. The car was moving, but it wasn't moving forward, it was moving through something. Suddenly, the car lurched forward with a jolt, sending Emily's body lurching against the seat belt. She turned to the side, expecting to see the man still sitting there, but his face was blank, a hollow mask. And then, for just a fleeting moment, his true face emerged, no longer human. His skin seemed to shimmer and shift, like a veil of smoke, revealing something darker, something otherworldly. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she turned away, unable to tear her eyes away from the strange apparition that stared back at her in horror. The shadowed figure in the mirror, the woman who had been running behind her, suddenly appeared beside the man, her hand reaching out from the glass, her face twisted in pain. There was a terrifying realization now. Emily wasn't just driving. She wasn't simply lost on a dark road. She was caught, trapped in a place where time had no meaning, where past and present twisted and bled into one another. Her hands gripped the wheel with one final surge of desperation. She could feel her pulse racing, every instinct screaming at her to stop, to escape, to flee. But no matter how fast she drove, the fog never thinned. The road never ended. Where are we going? She gasped, her voice trembling with fear. The man's cold voice whispered in her ear, as though he were standing right next to her. Wherever the road leads. Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles were white. His words echoed in her mind, swirling with dread, but she forced herself to keep her eyes on the road. She was trapped in this fog, with no direction, no idea of where she was going, and worst of all, no idea who this man was. She stole a quick glance at him. His face remained blank, his hood casting shadows that obscured most of his features. His eyes, those empty black eyes, seemed to bore into her very soul, but Emily couldn't look away. The longer she stared, the more unsettled she became, as if something was tugging at her memory, like she should recognize him, but she couldn't place where from. The fog pressed in around them, thicker now, making it harder to see the road ahead. The headlights illuminated nothing but a thick, swirling mist, a white nothingness that consumed everything in its path. It was like they were moving through an endless void, the world outside fading into obscurity. Waiting for me, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her mind raced. What did he mean? Waiting for her? How did he know her name? The questions piled up, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. The silence between them thickened, heavier with each passing second. Her anxiety began to swell like a rising tide, threatening to pull her under. What was this? A sick joke? Or something more sinister? Finally, Emily couldn't take it any longer. She had to ask. What do you want? Her voice was steadier now, but the question hung in the air like a curse. Her heart pounded in her chest. The man's lips parted, and for the first time since he'd gotten in the car, he spoke again. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried an eerie weight, as if each word was charged with an unspoken truth. I don't want anything. I've already taken it. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. For a moment, the man was silent again. She could feel his eyes on her, but when she glanced over, he was staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. There are places where time doesn't matter, he said cryptically. Places where the past and the future collide. This road is one of them. Emily's stomach churned. What does that mean? What does this have to do with me? You don't know yet, but you will. His lips curled into something like a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The smile was empty, like a mask that was too small for his face. You're already part of it. This road, this night, it's all connected. You were always meant to be here. Stop. Emily shouted, her voice raw with fear. I don't understand. Who are you? Where are you taking me? The man's smile faded, and for the first time, he turned to face her fully. His eyes, those deep, black eyes, were all-consuming, filled with a darkness that felt like it reached into the very marrow of her bones. It doesn't matter where we're going, he said softly. It's where you're going that counts. Where you belong. Emily slammed her foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt. The tires skidded slightly on the wet asphalt, and the sound of rubber against the road filled the cabin. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and she couldn't bring herself to look at him. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What was this? What was happening? She was losing control. The situation was slipping from her grasp, and she was powerless to stop it. The fog had closed in so thick around the car that she could barely see the end of the hood. The road felt different now. Wrong. Like it was leading somewhere that didn't exist in the world she knew. The man remained silent, his eyes still fixed on her. His lips were slightly parted as though he were waiting for something. His presence had become too much, suffocating, pressing down on her chest with every passing second. The air in the car felt dense, heavy, almost like it was closing in on her. She could hardly breathe. Get out, Emily muttered through clenched teeth, her voice low but firm. I want you to get out. Now. But the man didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of his lips. You can't go back, Emily, he whispered, his voice filled with an unnerving calm. The road doesn't work like that. It's already begun. His words were like ice, sinking deep into her soul. What do you mean? She gasped, but no answer came. It felt like the car was suffocating her, the windows closing in on her, trapping her with him. The fog outside seemed to be pressing closer and closer, swirling like a vortex around the car. Emily could hear a faint hum in the air now, a sound she hadn't noticed before, like the hum of an old, decaying machine coming to life. She couldn't take it anymore. She didn't know what he meant, but she had to get away from him. She couldn't stay on this road, not with him in the car, not with the terrible weight of his presence pressing down on her. In one frantic motion, she threw the car into reverse, her hands shaking as she struggled to get the car moving backward. The engine roared in protest, but Emily didn't care. She slammed the gas pedal down harder, desperate to escape. But the fog didn't relent. The mist outside thickened, and the road behind her was a blur, as though it was slipping away into nothingness. The further she drove, the more impossible it became to turn around. Emily felt herself becoming disoriented. The world outside the car wasn't the same as it had been when she first started this journey. The air had changed, the feeling of time had warped, and all she could do was move forward. But every time she looked in the rearview mirror, the man was still there sitting silently beside her, his eyes locked on her, unwavering. The tension inside the car had reached its peak. Every part of Emily's body was screaming for her to escape, but there was no way out. The fog had enveloped them completely, as if the road itself had swallowed them whole. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her chest felt like it was constricted by an invisible force. The man's gaze hadn't wavered. His unblinking eyes were locked on hers, cold, empty, and somehow, knowing. She tried to steady herself, to hold her ground, but the sense of dread creeping up her spine was overwhelming. "Where are you taking me?" Emily's voice was a mere whisper, trembling with fear. The man's smile grew wider, unsettlingly slow, stretching across his face. The silence in the car was suffocating, the hum of the engine and the sound of her own breath the only noise. "I'm not taking you anywhere," he said, his voice like a quiet breeze that sent shivers down her spine. "You're already where you need to be." Her heart dropped into her stomach. What did he mean? Emily tried to speak, but her throat felt dry, tight almost as if the words wouldn't come out. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. She felt like she was sinking deeper into some dark, endless abyss, and there was no escape. Her gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, and for just a split second, she saw a shadow shift behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she whipped her head around. But the back seat was empty. No trace of him. No sign of movement. Her pulse quickened. Panic surged through her veins. Where had he gone? Frantically, she checked the rearview mirror again. The road behind her was just as dark and fog-choked as the one ahead, but there was no figure standing there, no trace of the man. Her stomach twisted with a sickening sense of foreboding. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? Had she imagined the whole thing? But just as quickly as the thought crossed her mind, she felt it, the shift in the air. The chill creeping into the car. Something was wrong. A presence was there, lingering in the shadows, unseen but felt. She couldn't take it any longer. She slammed the brakes, veering off the road and onto the gravel shoulder. The tires screeched as she tried to control the car, her heart pounding in her chest. The car came to a violent halt, and for a moment, everything was still. Silent. But when she turned to her side, the man's seat was completely empty. There was nothing. No one. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He was gone. As if he had never been there at all. She checked the back seat again. Empty. The rearview mirror? Empty. No trace of him remained. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the dark fog outside, expecting to see him standing at the edge of the road, watching her. But the night was eerily still, only the soft whistle of the wind through the trees breaking the silence. Her head spun. What the hell is going on? She threw her car into drive, eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Her hands were still shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of everything. But the more she looked, the more impossible it seemed. Had she imagined the man? Had she been dreaming? But no. Her heart still raced, and the tension in her muscles was real. The fear she felt wasn't imagined. As she sped away, her mind raced. She couldn't stay on this road. She needed to get back to civilization, back to safety. But the thickening fog and the oppressive silence made her feel like she was trapped in some otherworldly place, suspended between reality and something darker. Then, just as she thought she might be able to breathe again, she heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. "I'll see you again." The words were low and sinister, like a promise that sent icy chills down her spine. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned her head sharply, but there was no one there. No one. The road stretched out before her, but it felt different now. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it felt alive, like it was closing in, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. And then, just as quickly as the whisper had come, it was gone, leaving only the heavy weight of dread hanging in the air. Her hands trembled on the wheel as her eyes darted around the dark road. What did he mean? What had she just heard? She tried to shake off the feeling, to convince herself it was just the stress of the night, the fear. But deep down, she knew. She had felt it. The man hadn't left her. He was still out there, watching her. As Emily sped through the fog, her gaze flicked to the rearview mirror once again. This time, she didn't want to see what she saw. Her breath froze in her chest. A shadow, no, a figure stood behind her, reflected in the glass. Tall, dark, and motionless. Her eyes locked onto the road ahead, her foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. She didn't dare look back again. She couldn't. But she knew he was there. And she knew no matter how fast she drove, no matter how far she tried to run, she couldn't escape. Not anymore.